Alright, welcome to the Strange North channel. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the Falcon Lake UFO incident that happened in 1967. This happened in the Whiteshell Provincial Park of Manitoba, and this is one of Canada's best known UFO sightings and one of the most well-documented sightings in the world. It's also one of many UFO-related events that happened in Canada in 1967. I already covered the Dumal crop circles that were discovered in 1967 in Alberta in a previous video. And in another video, I'd like to cover the Shag Harbour incident that occurred in Nova Scotia in 1967. And this is also the year that Canada opened the world's first official UFO landing pad in St. Paul, Alberta. And so Canada's centennial year was really a big year for UFO sightings. The Falcon Lake, Manitoba incident has been dubbed Canada's best documented UFO sighting by CBC. And according to Atlas Obscura, this is the world's most documented UFO sighting. And so if you're interested in the subject, particularly within the context of Canada, then you might find this video interesting, and I'm just going to jump right into it. Now, there was a man named Steve Michalak. Sometimes his name is listed as Stefan, and people often just refer to him as Steve. He lived with his family in River Heights, Winnipeg, and he was an industrial mechanic by occupation and trade. He was also an amateur geologist, and he would often travel around Manitoba prospecting for quartz and silver, and he often visited Falcon Lake, which is in the Whiteshell Provincial Park in Manitoba. Steve was aware of the fact that there were quartz veins within the Precambrian portions of the Canadian Shield in this provincial park, and that these areas also contained precious metals like gold and nickel. And so on May 20th of 1967, Steve is out at the lake prospecting. This is the May long weekend in Canada. This is sort of the kickoff to the summer season, and Steve is hanging out prospecting at this park just like he's done many times in the past. And on May 20th, Steve said that he was out doing his usual thing, and that all of a sudden he was startled by the sounds of a flock of geese who had been agitated by some object. Steve said that he turned around and that he saw two objects hovering above the ground, and this was about 150 feet away from where he was standing. He said that these things emitted a reddish glow and that they looked like cigarette-shaped craft with humps in the middle. And initially he thought they were American military experimental aircraft. Steve said that one of the two objects hovered for a little bit and then flew off. And then the second object landed on a nearby rocky platform and transformed from a cigarette shape into a disc shape. So this thing actually shifted forms. The second object that landed on the rocky platform sat there for about half an hour. And Steve said that he was so interested in this thing that he actually sat there and sketched out the craft on paper as it was sitting there. After a while, Steve approached the craft and he noticed that there was no identifying insignia on the exterior. There was nothing indicating where this thing was from or who it belonged to. He said that this craft had a smooth metallic surface resembling colored glass, and that there were no visible seams in its construction. Steve said this thing was about 34 feet in length and about 15 feet in height. This craft also changed in color between gray and red and resembled hot stainless steel. At times, Steve said there was a golden glow coming from the craft and that this thing emitted warm air. He also said that this craft emitted the scent of sulfur and that it made sounds of a whirring motor and that there was the sound of hissing air being expelled out of it. According to Steve, all of a sudden a hatch opened on the side of the craft and light came out of it, and he said that he heard muffled voices coming from within the craft. He said it sounded like there were a couple people in there. The voices sounded human, and that one voice was distinctly higher than the other one. Like I said, Steve initially thought this was an American experimental craft, and he said that he tried communicating with these Yankee boys to offer mechanical support. He assumed that the pilots were just having technical problems with this craft. He said that when he attempted to speak to these voices, they went silent. He initially tried speaking in English, but he was also fluent in Polish, Russian, and German, and he tried speaking in these languages as well, but to no avail. Steve Michalak then said that he put on his welding goggles to protect himself from the intense light coming out of this thing, and he actually went inside the craft. Once inside, he said that he saw light beams and panels everywhere that were flashing various colors in random sequences, but he could not see anyone in this craft, and he was thinking it could have been an unmanned drone or maybe a remote-controlled scout reconnaissance craft. Steve then stepped back outside, and he said when he did this, 3 panels on the side of the craft slid in to completely seal it off. Steve claimed that he touched the craft in curiosity and it was so hot that the fingertips of his gloves completely melted off. Apparently, the craft then turned counterclockwise and revealed a panel with a grid of holes that emitted a blast of heated gas, and this hit Steve in the chest, which blew him backwards off his feet and set his clothes on fire. Steve said he immediately started tearing off his burning clothing and the craft flew away. Steve said that after this happened, he felt really weird. He had a terrible headache, he was disoriented and nauseous, and he vomited a bunch of times. He then gathered himself up to return to his motel room at the Falcon Motor Hotel. As he was sort of in this weird state, wandering over to his hotel, he ran into a nearby highway patrol officer from the RCMP named Constable G.A. Salaki. This constable spotted Steve and assumed he was drunk, but he didn't smell any alcohol. Constable Salaki's report said that he offered to help Steve Michalak return to his hotel room and eventually seek treatment at Falcon Beach, but that Steve declined to be helped at all. However, Steve Michalak claimed that when he ran into Constable Salatsky, that this constable was very dismissive and refused to offer him any aid. Steve then returned to his motel room, talked with the motel owner, who informed him that the local doctor was absent. And so Steve then rested a bit, phoned his wife, and he told her that an accident occurred and that he would be taking the Greyhound bus home to Winnipeg. Upon returning to Winnipeg, Steve immediately sought attention at the Misericordia Health Center and he was admitted to the emergency room. Steve had burns on his chest and stomach in a grid-like pattern of raised sores. He was also experiencing prolonged bouts of diarrhea, headaches, blackouts, and continued weight loss. Steve eventually received help from the Mayo Clinic, which is a very prestigious medical institution, and professionals at this clinic, after inspecting Steve and listening to his story, determined that he appeared to be of sound mind, and it really appeared that he was telling the truth. Apparently, Steve's condition was allegedly consistent with radiation poisoning, but a bunch of extensive tests administered at Pinawa, Manitoba following the incident came up negative for radiation poisoning. Apparently, Steve's lymphocyte count drastically fell to lethal levels, and he continued to have intermittent reappearances of his burns. This is a quote from Steve's son, Stan Michalak, after Stan's dad came home from the hospital following the incident. Quote, "I recalled seeing him in bed. He didn't look good at all. He looked pale, haggard. When I walked into the bedroom, there was a huge stink in the room, like a real horrible aroma of sulfur and burnt motor. It was all around and it was coming out of his pores. It was bad. I was very afraid. My dad had been injured and I didn't know anything about it." End quote. After Steve returned to his small River Heights bungalow to recover at home, he was visited by many people, including officials from the RCMP, the United States Air Force, the Canadian Air Force, as well as various government agencies and media members. Members of the curious public would camp out on the family's front lawn, and the family received endless phone calls, and Steve's son Stan said he was often followed to school by people with questions. The case was investigated heavily by the United States Air Force, who after thorough investigations deemed it to be interesting and unexplainable, which is interesting because the US Air Force wouldn't even admit the same thing about the New Mexico Roswell incident of 1947. The RCMP retrieved a bunch of Steve's belongings from around the event, including his gloves, some tools, and a shirt, and they had it tested at a lab and they were unable to determine the cause of the burns. The RCMP also said that at the landing site there was a circle about 15 feet in diameter that was devoid of the grass and moss that was growing in other areas of this rocky outcropping. And they also claimed that soil samples and clothing samples were deemed highly radioactive, and that the same was said for pieces of metal that had been chipped out of cracks in the rock about a year after the incident. There were these little pieces of metal that had somehow been melted into this rock where this craft had allegedly landed. As he was recovering, Steve Michalak grew very tired of this intense media scrutiny, and he really shied away from interviews initially. And he even wrote in a manuscript that at one time he attempted to completely break off contact with the outside world. Steve said that he regretted telling his story to the public and that he had had domestic problems after the event because his wife Maria really struggled to help him following this traumatic event. Steve and his family continued to face continuous harassment and endless phone calls, and his son Stan was even bullied at school over this event. Some initial conclusions after officials questioned Steve following the event were that he might have been hallucinating as a result of alcohol consumption, but further investigations by the Air Force and the RCMP and the Royal Canadian Air Force were very inconclusive. The RCMP emphasized their inability to explain Michalak's burns and physical ailments, as well as the burned circle of vegetation at the alleged craft landing site. site. And many independent psychiatrists and psychologists said that Steve was of sound mind and appeared to be telling the truth. And a substantial number of publications from the investigations exist on record. These include RCMP and Royal Canadian Air Force reports on the case held within the National Archives, the United States Air Force file on the incident, as well as the Mayo Clinic correspondence by physicians and professionals who treated Steve. Of course, skeptics thought that Michalak's burns could have been caused by a drunken stupor, that he might have gotten drunk and accidentally burned himself, although this doesn't really explain the very well documented and unusual pattern of burns that Steve had on his body. Aaron Sekulik, writing for the Iron Skeptic, agrees with this alcohol use explanation, and he made note of Steve's inconsistencies when reporting his interaction with the RCMP officer that initially met with him after the event. Steve Michalak claimed that during the weekend that this happened, he had nothing to drink, but this was refuted by a bartender at the Falcon Lake Hotel who claimed to have seen Steve Michalak drink at least 5 beers the night before the event. Although this doesn't really explain what happened to him. People don't drink 5 beers and then have a strange event like this the next day. John B. Alexander, writing in the Journal for Scientific Exploration, states that some of Steve's long-lasting effects like skin lesions could actually be due to allergic reactions, and he also made note of some of Michalak's inconsistencies in talking about this event. Steve Michalak would maintain his story until he died in 1999, and according to him, he thought that this thing was some sort of experimental aircraft and not necessarily extraterrestrial. And the story has been featured in various media over the years. This incident was covered in Unsolved Mysteries Season 5, Episode 8, where Stan Michalak is interviewed and actors replay the incident. In 2010, singer-songwriter Jim Bryson with the Weakerthans released their album The Falcon Lake Incident, which was recorded at a cottage at Falcon Lake and was inspired by this event. The 2013 film Rulers of Darkness was also inspired by the events at Falcon Lake. And in 2017, Steve Michalak's son Stan co-authored a book with Chris Rakowski called When They Appeared, Falcon Lake 1967, The Inside Story of a Close Encounter. This is an excellent book on the topic as it's partially written by Steve's son, and Chris Rakowski is really one of the most well-regarded people in terms of UFO and unusual research within Canada. In 2018, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Falcon Lake event, the Royal Canadian Mint issued a $20 non-circulating silver coin as part of its Canada's Unexplained Phenomena series of coins. This coin glowed in the dark and it had beams appearing to emanate from the underside of a UFO. It was the first coin of its type to feature glow-in-the-dark elements. The front side has Queen Elizabeth II, as you might expect, and then the back side has a picture of Steve Michalak falling backward from a craft exhaust blast in the Manitoba wilderness while a UFO hovers above him. And there are only 4,000 copies of this coin in existence, and honestly I'd love to get my hands on one at some point. Documents that were collected pertaining to this incident were donated to the University of Manitoba archives in 2019, and this included a bunch of burned items of clothing that Steve Michalak was apparently wearing during his encounter. And like I mentioned, Steve Michalak passed away in 1999, and until his death he maintained his story. He said that he was telling the truth about what had happened to him, and that he thought that this thing was some sort of experimental aircraft and not necessarily extraterrestrial or from some other planet or star system. And so that's basically the story of the Falcon Lake, Manitoba incident. It's one of Canada's most well-known UFO encounters, and along with the Shag Harbour incident of 1967, which I'm going to cover in another video, this makes up one of the major UFO events that occurred in Canada in 1967. Obviously, you can Google the story to get more information, but I definitely recommend the book co-written by Chris Rakowski and Stan Michalak. That's one of the best sources of information available on this case. And of course, if you're really fascinated by this case, you can always visit Falcon Lake, Manitoba and visit the location for yourself. I hope you found that interesting and informative, and if you'd like to watch more of my content in general, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload at least one new video per week. And please leave your comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Falcon Lake incident, as well as any other UFO related comments you might want to make. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.